So, Troy, good morning. Delighted to have you here. So, what have you learned, and how do you manage these different cultures, both in which you operate and within the company?
It's a big question. I think firstly is I'm not a policy person, so I'm very much operating at the level of how you build the conversations, the engagement, the joint planning to make this stuff work. And as we work across most jurisdictions, increasingly, and I look at people like Mark Kunafati and Ro here in terms of learning that the quality of conversations, the courageous conversations that started in South Africa with Mark Kudafani and post the Marikana massacre there, and the way that you talk, the way you approach communities, the way you engage on these issues is becoming more and more important all the time. So whether that is a conversation in the south of Congo, whether it is the Andes of Peru, or whether it's an Indigenous community in Australia, the same approach of meeting with a community or stakeholder and coming with a mindset that says, we're all in this together. We're in a joint venture, whether we are an ownership part, a participant part, bringing land, bringing culture. And we're going to have a conversation about what good looks like and understand at the start that all our goods are different. And the best thing we can possibly do is find a place where we balance them all together. And none of us have that, are bringing that as an outcome. We find that by that conversation. And I think that's the biggest learning, because I think they just mentioned unnatural partnerships, or those conversations where people who should not have common ground come together to find it, is the way that you build solutions that would not otherwise have occurred. And that's the biggest single lesson from working across all those jurisdictions in all those places, and we're learning it day to day.
Well, I'll talk to you about the differences between the different areas you operate, as well as the similarities. But the other thing I wanted to talk to you about was, what difference does having Chinese majority ownership make to you and how you deal with things? There's a perception, of course, amongst many people, that Chinese majority ownership, ultimately owned by the Chinese government, means that they're very interventionist. How do you find that?
Which I held to. So when I started at MMG, I think about 12 years ago, I really had an idea the same, that you would get in here, there would be lots of instructions, there would be areas, there would be a lot of understanding. That hasn't been the case at all. What is the case is that Chinese capital and Chinese state-supported capital is being deployed through our platform to encourage development, and that's it. So during that time, we've bought mines with 100% offtakes to third parties. And China did not say, we need that offtake. It said, great, we've got a mine, it's a good profitable mine, we'll make money, let's go. In terms of, and I've been, and Andrea was with you today, but the spokesperson on behalf of MMG for many, many years, not once have I had an advice of what to say or not to say. Because, and when you look at the critical mineral debate today, which is another classic escalation of that strange conversation around China, it's one, China is not really in that debate. Everyone talks about China, but no one really talks on behalf or directly from it. And secondly, that's because in some ways China has a very clear geopolitical position around the world, which is largely non-interventionist. It doesn't want people involved in its politics, and it doesn't want to get terribly involved in others. And so companies like us are given very clear operating instructions of behave like an excellent international mining company, access good assets and run them well, and produce the best profit you can, and drive development. And that's the instruction we've had for all these years. That's how we work. And in many cases, it's coming up against that question every day of our lives. Yep. And answering it is actually part of the job that we do. And there is no mining company that does not have complications in ownership. You know, it's almost all are majority foreign controlled by capital. Almost all are operating in jurisdictions that are challenging. Having a conversation that acknowledges who you are, what your limitations are, but also what you can do, is the basis of any good relationship.
And does that make it more difficult in some countries? I mean, obviously there's, talk in the US, despite their relationship with China, the strategic competition. Does that make it more difficult to operate in some countries than others?
It does, and and I've had a lot of discussion with other Chinese companies, the perception makes it worse than reality. Mm-hmm. So it's not that foreign investment review boards or investment will stop you acquiring. The biggest impact is that investors and vendors of assets and others will perceive you'll have that trouble, and therefore they will discount your involvement because of the perceived issue that you will possibly have. When you get to managing the issue itself, it's usually not anywhere near as bad. We've worked, our company was started through a FIRB rejection of an original takeover offer. In 2 days, our major shareholder changed the offer, went to FIRB, got a new agreement, the company was formed. We've worked under our Foreign Investment Review Board compliance all the time since then. And if we were to find an asset in Australia tomorrow to acquire, we would sit down with the Foreign Investment Review Board, talk through how we would structure a transaction that was in the benefit of Australia as well as our major shareholder. That's clear, but the perception that gives and the discussion, I would say unhelpful discussion around like-minded companies and critical minerals and otherwise is just stopping the free allocation of capital moving where it needs to be to meet the very big challenges that Ro and others have put out there about how do you possibly decarbonise this world over the next 10, 20, 30 years.
Okay. Now, one of the things that one of the people mentioned today, one of the questions said, we seem to see this repetition of many of the same issues of social trust repeated globally, in communities all over the world. But there's obviously differences, though, in terms of the different cultures in which you operate. And so I'm fascinated, Las Bambas in Peru, for example, has obviously had a lot of reputational issues. There's lots of difficulties in building that social license and trust. And unlike Anglo-American, you didn't stop operations. You kind of kept working your way through. So explain to us how you manage that and how you're building that social license and trust with, in a very difficult environment.
Lucky it's just the two of us, I can be honest. It has definitely been a different dynamic. Las Bambas was, when we acquired the asset, it was 60% built. And the first time I visited, the community had not relocated. There were livestock wandering through the construction site. There were houses still sitting there. It was built in situ as the negotiations were happening. And in many ways, it did not have the luxury to stop for 2 years to re-debate that process.
No co-design possible there.
It wasn't. And so we have worked for the last almost 10 years trying to design while building and operating. And that is a much more difficult way to do it. Plus, Las Bambas is unique, I think, globally in that it is 700 plus kilometres from the site. We have over 80 communities directly impacted by those operations, and they are communities in the Andes with almost no experience with an economic. When the project first started, there was no currency. It was a barter economy. There was no experience of mining. There was a rich and difficult history of colonisation from the Spanish. We had everything you could have, and one of the things I struggle most in dealing with ESG analysts and this is that a degree of debate and a degree of conflict is a fundamentally bad thing in their eyes. And for me, that is what messy community relations and joint development is. It's a difficult conversation, and the more transparency and the more you see, the more you're probably having an open and balanced conversation. And so I would love to have the approach that was able to be done at Quellaveco with Anglo-American and take the time. We didn't have it. And so therefore you have to have a more messy and more open conversation. And that's the best way, because the alternative is much worse. And so we are struggling with the communities around Las Bambas, but we are getting better every day. And the conversation at the base level is not one, and I've been involved in it, and weekly we are intensely at the moment. It's never take this mine away, stop what you're doing. It's how do we all participate in this process in a way that balances all our needs and gives us and what we need. And that's governments, local governments, communities, that's all of the environmental and logistics and infrastructure issues. And there is no solution that balances all of them. You're going to have to trade off, and those trade-offs are best done when everybody is talking publicly and seeing them. And from outside and from media and from an ESG analyst, that looks messy. but that's how the world should work. And I push back whenever I see the ESG saying and to be honest, Las Bambas, when you look at the global human rights, I can't remember the network, the network on business and human rights, I think Las Bambas is the most complained asset. Now that is based on number of media mentions and issues raised in public. It is not based anything on what's happening on the ground in terms of how we're working with it. And we have, as you saw in Anglo-American, those dialogue tables, we have about 16 currently functioning dialogue tables amongst those communities. We are working every day. The conversations are difficult but progressive. And over time, Las Bambas, I believe, will become a great example of how to build a mine in the middle of communities in a very green area with surrounded by infrastructure and development issues, and to do it in a sustainable way. But it doesn't look pretty.
So you talked about the trade-offs. What type of trade-offs does the company make? I mean, we had an example today where a company said, somebody said, oh, well, a company built 2 projects side by side rather than just one, even though that wasn't nearly as effective. Do you do things like that, or is it too late for that? Or are you talking more about promising more financial returns, promising more environmental, aware operations? What type of trade-offs?
I think, and I've had the benefit of seeing all the panels this morning, I come down to participation. Participation is when the groups or the stakeholders, wherever you put, need to come together to decide what they are. Because it's not us saying we'll make a big change to the operations. So we are building a second pit at the moment, which is critical to Las Bambas' development. We have been in discussions, we've had the permitting now for a number of years, and we have been in discussions for about 4.5 years on exactly the development structure that you need to put together to make that work. Now, in the end, that will be one that now we have bought the land and we own it. We have all the government permits to do it. We are talking to a community who sold that land to us about how they want to participate. And that's where you get the best solutions on what works, because it's not us to say that. It needs to be co-designed.
And does that include like promises of jobs or education? What does that mean?
It will look like community companies stood up to directly participate in that whole value chain as it's created. It will look like development outcomes, education, skills, training. It will look like infrastructure investments. And it will also look like a partnership between the government being brought in to work with this and deliver basic services and economic development in that region. I can't remember what the quote was, but most good solutions look very similar. They have everyone there. Bad ones look very different.
Well, what about the solutions in the DRC, for example? Is that very different operating there?
Fundamentally, the DRC is a very mineral-rich, asset-rich agriculture. It is a fantastic country. That development has been cruel by a troubled past, colonisation, dictators. It's had everything thrown at it. But it is still...
It's also got a reputation for a lot of corruption and bribery. How do you manage that?
It's difficult because in those countries, that from low-level facilitation payments to bribery are part of the operating landscape. And so you can't go in there thinking that the same approach you take in Australia or Peru is going to work there. You have to build a way of approaching that allows you to work well. Part of the best way to get through places where corruption is endemic is to have everything done by transparent agreements and to publicise those agreements. And so that because you're dealing, the corruption is covering up a system that is not working well. If you are a public servant in Congo, you don't usually get paid. It just never happens. Your pay packet doesn't come through. You find ways to survive and live by using your position in low-level facilitation payments, essentially. It's a tough place to be, and other parts of the community have no economic base. So the corruption is endemic, yes, but the solution to it is working every day. And I look back, and when I say the critical minerals debate of today, we go back to when we arrived, which was the conflict minerals debate around DRC. And the impact of that conflict minerals legislation on the people at the ground level of DRC was terrible, because what little economic base they had in many places was ripped out very quickly, and nothing was there. And they're slowly rebuilding that. It's that difference between international policy and what looks great when you're sitting at a World Economic Forum or otherwise, and actual impacts on how people live every day on the ground, which is what mining should be good at, because we live with them. But it's knowing the risks, knowing who we are and what we can and can't do, bringing in governments and communities and having those solutions. And yes, messy solutions are usually the good ones.
So in Australia, for example, you're certainly not dealing with corruption and bribery, at least I certainly hope not, but I don't think so. But for example, in Tasmania, you've been held up for a long time in trying to build your tailings dam in the Tarkine, another tailings dam. Time is money. Time is of the essence, as one of our speakers said before. How do you balance that, trying to get community support when that takes a very, very long time, even with the best of intentions, and just a basic fundamental disagreement about what should be allowed?
Mining is a contact sport. You can't. Rosebery has been there for 90 years in that environmental sensitive area, and for 90 years it has produced critical minerals, largely processed in Australia, for international export. So it is exactly the success story that the Australian government now wants to build. Yet 90 years in, we need to expand a small footprint to increase our tailing storage. And that happens to cross a river where an environmental group has drawn a line in the sand to say, you shall not. Now, every other permit, every other government discussion, everything else says that's not a bad place to build it in terms of environmental values and biodiversity. It's just that a particular group says this is our line in the sand and we don't want you to go there. Now, from the start, we've done a process of two things. One, to continue to work on that site, even with knowing that gives the Bob Brown Foundation a wonderful platform to raise money and raise awareness. And number two, to look at all the other options that may be environmentally, biodiversity, socially better. And we need to keep running those, because the best decision is between those two. And too often, and I see in many jurisdictions, people walk away from that first option at the first sign of trouble, because it is easy, it is better, and it's tough having those arguments. But then you're going and doing what may be an environmentally second-class option, purely because one particular group decided it was. In the end, we will decide how to solve our tailings problem at Rosebery, I hope, on the best of environmental, biodiversity assessment, social baseline work. And if that is not the Bob Brown site, that is great, and that will make life easier for us. But if it is, then we should have that argument that says we have done everything. That is the highest standard of environmental impact you can have. And then it's a stakeholder decision between government, us, others, to work out whether we go ahead. But that one single voice decides where you can and can't do something is something that everybody in the community should have trouble with.
Well, I think that's going to be a continuing discussion for a lot of companies across any culture, including in Australia, as we face the next decade. But in terms of a contact sport, I can see Shireen basically ready to shove us off the dais. So thank you very much for your help. That was a really great discussion.